All right, YouTube, it's time to talk about something that I think a lot of people actually overlook, and it's rather strange that they do. The difference between a multi ethnic, multiracial, or whatever society and a multicultural society. The left, specifically the social justice left, the modern left nouveau, you could term it or whatever, wants you to believe that in order for a society to flourish, it has to be multicultural. What does this connotate? What it means when they say multicultural is essentially people should not assimilate. People should essentially, when they immigrate to a new country, they should keep doing exactly what they're doing. The culture itself has to bend and give way to the cultural traditions and norms of whatever immigrant group happens to be favored by the same social justice league. In Europe, this means predominantly Islam. Of course, many other groups that have migrated into Europe over time assimilated, whether it be Europeans going to a different European nation, people from certain colonial regions that used to be part of various European empires. You would think of France and some of the states that were founded from their colonies or the British Empire or something. Over time, people migrated from these places, and many of them assimilated. If you were to speak to them, you would find they were born and raised in now what is the home country of the UK or France or wherever, or Germany. And they go there, they're born and raised there, they stay there for an extended period, they adopt the accent, they adopt the language, they adopt the cultural norms insofar as they're able to stand doing so. The idea, up until fairly recently in Western history, was that if a person migrated to another culture, it must mean that they like enough aspects of that culture to want to be there. Therefore, because the culture is presumably to their mind superior to the culture which they left, on a fiscal basis, on a social basis, whatever, somebody's fleeing violence, somebody's trying to, make their way in life and get wealthy or comparatively wealthy or something. If they're moving to another country, they're doing so with the intent to assimilate into it, specifically because they realize that that culture, for their own purposes, is superior, if not on an objective basis. You get the idea of somebody coming to the United States, 100 years ago, say, oh, USA is great, here I can actually make money and have land. It's not like being in bad old Europe where, I'm living in a fucking tenement and half starved, eating nothing but cabbage soup or something like that. You get the view of the New World and the Statue of Liberty and the Star Spangled Banner, but you also get this as well in many other countries. The new ground zero for mass immigration in the world is not the United States, it's Europe. Which is very funny. The European countries have basically thrown open their borders and are letting people in, but here's the difference. Here is the big difference between the policies of the New World countries, that is Canada, the United States, anything in the Americas, the oceanic countries, Australia and New Zealand. Here's the difference between the New World countries, the sort of colonial nations, the New World, the more recently sort of explored regions of the world, and the Old World. The Old World was never built on the concept of immigration. The people there, the people who came over from Europe into what's now the United States or Canada or wherever, were the rebels. They were the people who didn't really care about the European cultural mode because they were trying to escape the European cultural mode, specifically high tax policies, impressment into service, mandatory draft laws, and things like that. Taxes in general that made no sense. Other policies that made no sense. The concept of having little to no religious liberty, actually, at the time, was a big issue for many people. You look at the Puritans or whatever. They escaped Europe because they couldn't live under that system anymore. You have all sorts of rebels and heretics and apostates and groups that were not generally seen as fitting in with whatever European culture they were from coming to the New World. They said, well, fuck this, we're just going to go over there. You know, the reach of the British Empire isn't so great that it can get us over here. We're just going to just come here and land, and we'll farm on our own. You know, we'll trade with the Indians or whatever. There is a difference between the policies that have been adopted by the New World and by Europe, essentially, but the Old World in general. If you look at mass immigration in Europe, the first thing is it's utterly unsustainable. The European population in some of the countries that are being most impacted, the population otherwise would be shrinking. That is, they've hit carrying capacity. People are not breeding as part of these native cultures. They are being displaced by immigrants. This would not necessarily matter so much if either the immigration rate was lower or the assimilation rate higher, but these countries have made no attempt whatsoever to get people to actually assimilate. The concept of assimilation is simply wherever you happen to be from, you have adopted the culture of the place where you've gone. Now, you don't need to utterly and completely assimilate, of course, if you look at the United States and you look at some of these urban boroughs in some of the larger cities. You'll find, you know, areas that resemble Ireland. You'll find areas that resemble Italy. You'll find areas that resemble any place you can happen to think of. You'll have a Polish neighborhood, an Italian neighborhood, a Chinese neighborhood, a Japanese neighborhood, Vietnamese neighborhood, Australian neighborhood, whatever you happen to have. That's all well and good. The idea is that they've joined the overarching culture in general. They're simply retaining, like, the cuisine of their motherland. The cuisine, maybe a certain accent or manner of speech, something like that, and they happen to have conglomerated into a given neighborhood or town or county or whatever. They've assimilated, either partially or completely. They respect the laws of the country that they've moved to. This is not the case in Europe, and here's the difference. The United States is a multi-ethnic society. Yes, this includes multiple ethnicities from European origin too. People often say, well, European boring, white boring, European all the same. No. Big difference between somebody from Romania and somebody from Ireland. Two totally different cultures with totally different histories. And you're going to piss a lot of people off in both countries if you try to claim that there's some general similarity between the two other than they happen to both be Europeans. You're going to piss a lot of people off. If you do that in Ireland, you'll probably get, you know, punched by somebody who's very, very drunk. Actually, that'll probably happen in Romania too. Anyways, in the New World, what we've typically got is high assimilation, because that's sort of the basis upon which these cultures were founded. They are multi-ethnic societies, but they are not multicultural societies. The expectation is people come in and they assimilate. This is what I'm a proponent of. This is what most other people in the United States are proponents of. I'm not against immigrants. But if they are coming here, yes, they need to obey the laws and the cultural norms of the United States. If they don't like that, they do not need to immigrate. I don't care how many people come here from Mexico if there's an intent to assimilate. I really don't care. I don't care if it's the whole population of Mexico. In Europe, though, only a handful of immigrants come into a country. They expect to be treated with special status, with special deference. You've got Sharia zones in the UK. You've got all sorts of areas in France where native French individuals will not venture because it's too fucking dangerous. You have a situation in Europe where the far left cultural Marxists have foisted on the people there that their own native culture, there's something wrong with it or something. And so they have to, I guess, adopt outside cultural practices. No people on Earth, regardless of what continent they're on or the color of their skin, should have to tolerate the displacement of their native culture, which should be celebrated the same as any other native culture on Earth, let's face it. No group of people should be forced to undergo that and see themselves displaced. But that's what we're seeing right now in the UK. The actual British are a dying breed in their own country. Swedes are a dying, well, no, some would say maybe the Swedes deserve it for their own policies and opinions. The Germans, the French, even the Greeks. Greece is undergoing a mass immigration crisis right now, too. Hell, Turkey is. Turkey's got hundreds of thousands of Syrian refugees in the country. Now, it boils down in Europe anyway. A debate over, well, are the Turks European? Are the Greeks European? What's an Anatolian? Let's look at some genetics here. And yet both of these countries are additionally being utterly and completely swamped by a bunch of Arabs and Mesopotamians. They've got the same problem. You've got this same problem, by the way, outside of Europe. You've had this problem at various times in other regions as well. Now, of course, some countries, like Russia currently, attempt to solve this through nationalistic sentiment and populism, sort of attempting to inject patriotism. This can work. It worked for the United States for most of its history. It's simply not clear whether an old world country can actually make it work. There's the problem with Europe. The problem with Europe is all of these different states were built originally as ethno-states anyway. They were mono-ethnic. They weren't built as multi-ethnic societies. They were built upon nationalistic principles to begin with, molded over the course of thousands of years. That's not how the New World was founded. If you look at countries that have birthright citizenship, they're almost all New World countries. Essentially, it's the Americas, plus a couple of countries in Asia. I think it's like Cambodia and Pakistan or one of these other countries. That's birthright citizenship. The rest are basically all in the New World. I think Colombia and like Panama are the only countries in the Americas that don't have it. And outside of the Americas, almost none of them do. The idea that you would be born into because the idea of the New World was nobody can deny our glory, our majesty, our superiority to the models used in Europe or the Middle East or Asia. That's the old world. They're boring, stale, they're culturally failing, they've got all sorts of social problems, they've got all sorts of fiscal problems, they're being strangled by bureaucracy, they're under a bunch of tyrannical monarchs that don't really know what they're doing. We've got a better system. So when people come over here from any part of the old world or from some other part of the new world, and they're born here, they're inevitably going to assimilate because we're superior. That's the way we've done business for hundreds of years. And it's largely worked. If you look, people talk about, oh, the United States has an unstable society. We've got all sorts of racial tension, all sorts of religious tension, all sorts of ethnic tension. People should learn English. People shouldn't have to learn English. People should be white. It doesn't matter what race you are. They debate all day over the status of the United States or of the Americas in general. My goodness, I have to think many of these people have never actually seen any story about what goes on in Europe on a regular basis. You think you've got it fucking bad. The immigrants here don't routinely durka jihad and behead people on a random basis. It just doesn't happen. You don't see people doing that here. You do in Europe, though, primarily because where are the immigrants coming from there? They're coming from the Islamic world. Now, the left, the social Marxists on the left are fond of pointing out, well, yeah, but, 90% of them, they're not actually violent. They're trying to escape violence. That's true. And I've pointed out before, there's one big problem with the way in which Europe is going about this. They are so politically correct, so socially Marxist, so duped by the people in power there that really they just see the migrants as a way to make more money and grind people down and excuse more tyrannical surveillance-related laws. They are so utterly fooled that they don't seem to understand one simple concept. Because of the open border policy, it doesn't matter how many peaceable Islamists come to Germany or France or the UK. Because all you need are a handful of jihadists to get in, which you can't keep them out because, your government's too politically correct to do so. And they'll radicalize all the others because they'll threaten to kill them if they don't radicalize. And so what you end up getting is the same problem that they had in their home country. You say, oh, we're taking these refugees because we don't want them to be killed. And yet you're letting in a bunch of jihadists that really want to kill these refugees. They consider them apostates. Once they gain enough power, they're going to purge all these other Muslims. They're also going to purge every native citizen. Sweden is already setting itself up to be purged at some point in the future. It will happen. The Swedish birth rate is so low and the immigrant birth rate so high. Give it 20 years and there'll be more Islamists in Sweden than there are native Swedes, including some native Swedes that have converted to Islam. Although the conversion rate of Islam is largely mythological, let's face it. Most people deconvert, at least in the civilized world. I don't know if Sweden really qualifies anymore under that term. Here you've got a country, once hailed as like the most educated, first world, forward-thinking society. They got the best prisons and great education and everything's clean and people are wealthy and literate and look at our trees and our supposedly good cuisine, although most of it's like lye bleached or something like that. Here you've got this shining example of a first world utopia. What do? The first chance they get, they start letting in refugees. And at first it's not a problem because they're, a tiny minority of refugees and they're not radicals. And then the radicals say, oh, look at all these apostates flooding Europe. Well, this is ripe for the picking. So then a bunch of the radicals go over and they start talking to the apostates, so-called, and say, oh, well, we're going to kill you if you don't radicalize. You'd better be supporting us. If you support the native Swedish culture, you're just an apostate and you're going to get killed. And it's not like the Swedish government's going to do anything to stop them. They're too politically correct to even label it terrorism or Islamic extremism. The same with the British government. The French government's got a little more of a level head now, kind of, sort of. Denmark is waking up. Spain is starting to... Italy's waking up. The Italians are ahead of the British and the Swedes when it comes to realizing exactly why their system is problematic. Multiculturalism has failed. It has failed in Sweden, it's failed in the UK, it's failed in France, it's failed in Germany. It's failed everywhere it's ever been implemented before in the history of the world. A multi-ethnic society is fine. It doesn't matter what background people are from if they're assimilating. The problem is the Europeans don't want them to assimilate. In fact, the cultural Marxists in Europe do not want immigrants to assimilate. They want either the native culture to assimilate to the immigrants, or they don't want anyone assimilating. They want the chaos. They want the fighting. It allows them to pass more draconian legislation that people otherwise wouldn't be comfortable with. More disarmament, more surveillance. Oh, we need more money for these programs to set up for these refugees. Meanwhile, most of that money probably gets siphoned off for other causes. You think the European governments are any better with money than the American government is? They're worse. They're even more bureaucratic and ineffective. They don't know what they're doing. And then people dare to complain about, far-righters that want to kill all immigrants or purge them or force them out. No, they don't. They just want people to assimilate. You look at a group like UKIP. UKIP, in my mind, has a pretty good idea. That is, they want to take people from former British regions, incorporate them into the country, really sort of abandon the failed EU model, and go back to how they were doing business before the EU existed. And people call them a bunch of far-right racists for this. But that doesn't make any sense. It's opposition to multiculturalism. It's not opposition to a multi-ethnic society or even a multiracial society. We've got a multiracial, multi-ethnic society in the United States. Our cultural stability is quite a bit higher than that of Europe, specifically because immigrants tend to assimilate here within a generation or two. Specifically because they begin to consider themselves Americans, because there's something worth considering yourself as. It's worth your time to consider yourself an American. There's actually a possibility that you can get by over here, unlike in Europe where 99% of what you make gets taken away by some governing authority to pay the pensions and welfare checks of people that, claim that they're a bunch of jihadists. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. So yes, I absolutely oppose multiculturalism. Countries need to protect their native culture. They don't need to adopt xenophobia in doing so. They simply need to encourage assimilation. Now, this works a lot better if you've got a country that's large and powerful and has a good reputation, like the United States. If you're some la la land so-called utopia like Sweden that many people in the world can't fucking find on a map, then nobody's going to want to assimilate to your culture because your culture is considered weak. It's considered a pussy culture, a wimpy culture. No wonder nobody assimilates. Why the hell are you taking so many refugees? It's obviously not helping your economic situation any. The government there claims, and this is the other problem, the governments, in enforcing these beliefs on people, always invariably claim, oh, it's for the good of all people. We want to be nice. Think of the children. Think of the families. Think of these poor refugees. Again, though, their own policies are also letting in the same zealots that are abusing those refugees. So people in Europe need to think about that good, long, and hard, about these open border policies that they have. Can you afford it in the long run? Why aren't people assimilating? Oh, it couldn't be because nobody really respects your cultures, all these fallen former empires that are now vassal states of the United States anyway. Nobody respects them. Certainly the refugees aren't respecting them. They're basically enforcing their own cultural laws. It's an alien culture to them. There's no reason for them to assimilate. They're not being told to assimilate. They're not being legally expected to do so. There's no cultural pressure for them to assimilate. There's no reason for them to assimilate whatsoever. They don't feel any pressure to do so, so they're not going to. You have to apply some sort of cultural pressure. Whether it's the carrot or the stick, it doesn't really matter. People have a right, an inalienable right, to defend their native culture against those who would wish to usurp it. The Europeans are doing a pretty piss-poor job at doing so. Unlike here in the West, the true West, the New World, we're doing just fine. People say, oh, the United States is falling any day now. No, it's not. We're just fine compared to the Europeans. You look at their news, it's a hell of a lot worse there than it is almost anywhere else on Earth. Parts of Britain now look like Mogadishu. How bad can it possibly get? It's getting worse by the day. You've got record numbers of refugees entering Europe now, specifically because of the crisis related to ISIS. And hell, these ISIS members probably pose as refugees and come over too. Who fucking knows? There's no control. There's no background checks being issued, really. They just sort of give them a cot to sleep in and a welfare check, and then they say, oh, you're European now. Whether or not you really care about being a European, oh, well, we'll tolerate you here because we're so forward thinking. Sorry, folks, multiculturalism will not work. Any culture that adopts it for an extended period will eventually collapse. Yeah, that's exactly what's going to happen. When the first European state topples as a result of these programs, then you'll see people start to wake up to the problem. Until then, people will call you a racist, bigot, or whatever for opposing it. But that's okay, because they're wrong. And in the long run, they will be proven wrong. That's about all. Peace out.